The book of Daniel is one of the most captivating and enigmatic books in the Bible, and its significance goes far beyond ancient history. It's a book full of visions, dreams, and prophecies that continue to shape our understanding of the world today. Among its many themes, one stands out in particular: the rise of a powerful figure known as the Antichrist. But how do we identify this figure? How does the book of Daniel help us recognize him? This video will dive deep into the prophecies of Daniel, unraveling the hidden clues that reveal the true nature of the Antichrist. From the 4 great empires prophesied in Daniel's dream to the terrifying vision of the little horn that grows among 10 kings, we will explore the fascinating connections between these ancient prophecies and the world we live in today. As we journey through the symbols and visions that Daniel received, we will also take a look at how these prophecies intersect with other biblical texts and what they tell us about the future. The book of Daniel is not just about predicting the end times, it's about understanding the signs that are already unfolding around us. As we examine the history and meaning of these prophetic symbols, you'll gain insights into how these ancient words are still relevant to us today. Stay with us until the end of this video, because the clues Daniel offers will change the way you view the world and prepare you for what's to come. You won't want to miss the powerful revelations waiting for you. Keep watching as we uncover the truth hidden within the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, one of the most profound and enigmatic books in the Bible, provides an extraordinary glimpse into the future and the struggles faced by the people of God in the face of oppressive forces. To understand its significance, it is essential to first consider its historical and cultural context, as this helps shed light on the intricate symbolism and prophetic messages it contains. Daniel was written during a tumultuous period in Israel's history. The book is set in the 6th century BC, a time when the Babylonian Empire dominated much of the ancient Near East. Israel had fallen to the Babylonians, and many of the people of Judah, including Daniel himself, were exiled to Babylon. This exile marked a significant turning point in Israel's story, as the people were displaced from their homeland and faced the challenge of maintaining their identity and faith in a foreign land. During this time, Babylon was the center of a vast empire known for its grandeur and power. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, is a central figure in the book of Daniel, and his reign is critical to understanding the book's broader message. Under Nebuchadnezzar's rule, the Babylonians not only conquered Israel, but also established their dominance over many surrounding nations. The Babylonian Empire was a symbol of human arrogance and idolatry, standing in stark contrast to the sovereignty of God, which Daniel's visions and messages emphasize. The book of Daniel itself is divided into 2 main sections. The first part, which covers chapters 1 through 6, consists largely of historical narratives and personal stories. These chapters recount Daniel's experiences in the Babylonian court, where he serves as a high-ranking official. In these stories, Daniel, along with his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, maintains his faith and loyalty to God despite the pressures to conform to Babylonian customs and worship idols. These narratives serve to demonstrate God's faithfulness to his people and his ability to deliver them from peril, whether from the fiery furnace or the lion's den. The second part of the book, chapters 7 through 12, contains Daniel's visions and prophecies about the future. These visions are highly symbolic and often foretell events that would unfold centuries later, leading up to the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. In these chapters, Daniel sees a series of beasts and symbols representing empires and rulers that will arise after Babylon's fall, including the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. These prophecies are not just about historical events, but also point to a future time of great tribulation, when a powerful and evil ruler, the Antichrist, will emerge to deceive the nations. In order to understand the significance of these prophecies, it is important to recognize that Daniel wrote during a time when Israel was suffering greatly, The Babylonian exile was a period of intense persecution and suffering for the Jewish people. Yet the book of Daniel was meant to provide hope and encouragement. It reminds the Israelites that, despite the dominance of foreign empires and the seeming triumph of evil, God remains sovereign over all nations and is ultimately in control of history. The book calls on God's people to remain faithful, to stand firm in their convictions, and to trust that God will bring about justice in His time. One of the most crucial aspects of the book of Daniel is its focus on the sovereignty of God over the affairs of the world. In Daniel's visions, he sees that human empires may rise and fall, but God's kingdom will endure forever. This theme is encapsulated in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, where the king sees a great statue made of various materials representing different kingdoms. However, a stone, cut without hands, strikes the statue and destroys it, representing the ultimate victory of God's kingdom over all earthly powers. The book of Daniel also introduces the concept of the time of the end, a period of unprecedented tribulation and suffering that will occur before God's final victory. In Daniel's vision of the four beasts in chapter 7, the fourth beast represents a future empire that will be ruthless and destructive. This beast, often associated with the Roman Empire, is also understood to symbolize a final future world empire led by the Antichrist. The rise of this evil ruler will be marked by deception, idolatry, and persecution, and he will seek to destroy God's people. However, Daniel also sees that in the end, the kingdom of God will prevail, and the saints will inherit the eternal kingdom. This tension between present suffering and future hope is a central theme in the book of Daniel. While the book acknowledges the reality of persecution and hardship, it also offers a vision of ultimate justice and the triumph of God's kingdom. The stories of Daniel and his friends in the Babylonian court demonstrate that, even in the midst of trials, God is present and will deliver His people. At the same time, the prophecies point to a future where God's ultimate rule will be established, bringing peace and righteousness to the world. In understanding Daniel's historical context, we can also gain insight into the broader biblical narrative. The book of Daniel is deeply connected to the themes of God's covenant with Israel, His judgment on the nations, and His plan for the salvation of the world. The book bridges the Old and New Testaments, pointing forward to the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who will fulfill the promises made to Israel and establish God's eternal kingdom. The book of Daniel is not just a story of the past. It also offers profound insights for the present and future. It teaches us that even in times of great turmoil and uncertainty, we can trust in God's sovereignty and His plan for the world. It calls us to remain faithful, to hold fast to our convictions, and to wait with hope for the coming of God's kingdom. In the end, the book of Daniel assures us that, despite the rise of evil powers and the persecution of God's people, God's reign will triumph, and His kingdom will never end. As we delve deeper into the prophecies of Daniel, we will see how the book reveals the identity of the Antichrist and the events leading up to the end of days. Understanding the historical background of Daniel's writings will help us interpret these prophecies more clearly, as they are not only rooted in the past, but also point to a future fulfillment. The book encourages believers to remain vigilant, prepared, and hopeful as we await the return of Christ and the establishment of His eternal kingdom. The prophetic visions of Daniel are among the most enigmatic and impactful sections of the Bible, offering a glimpse into the divine plan for the future of mankind. These visions, found primarily in the second part of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, carry deep symbolism and intricate imagery, and they are often interpreted in various ways by scholars and theologians. To fully understand the context of these prophecies, it is essential to grasp the historical and theological background in which they were given. Daniel's prophetic visions emerge in a time of great uncertainty and suffering for the Jewish people. Exiled in Babylon, far from their homeland, the Israelites were under the rule of foreign empires, including the Babylonians and later the Medo-Persians. The visions that Daniel received were not only meant for his time, but also carried messages for the future, including a glimpse of the ultimate victory of God's kingdom over earthly powers. These visions are deeply apocalyptic in nature, revealing the unfolding of God's sovereign will across the course of history. The first of Daniel's significant visions is recorded in chapter 7. In this vision, Daniel sees 4 great beasts rising from the sea, each one representing a different empire. The first beast, like a lion with eagle's wings, is often interpreted as symbolizing the Babylonian Empire, which Daniel himself was living under. The lion represents the strength and dominance of Babylon, while the eagle's wings point to its rapid rise to power. The second beast, resembling a bear raised up on one side, is thought to represent the Medo-Persian Empire, with the bear symbolizing its brute strength and the asymmetry of its power, perhaps reflecting the dominance of the Persian side over the Median side. The third beast, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, is generally seen as representing the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, who conquered much of the known world with incredible speed. The 4 heads could refer to the division of Alexander's empire after his death into 4 parts, ruled by his generals. Finally, the fourth beast, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen before, is a terrifying and powerful creature with 10 horns. This beast is often interpreted as symbolizing the Roman Empire, with its great power and military dominance. The 10 horns are generally seen as representing 10 kings or rulers, possibly symbolizing the later divisions of the Roman Empire. In the midst of this vision, Daniel sees a little horn that grows among the 10 horns of the fourth beast. This little horn is described as having eyes like a man and speaking boastfully. It is often understood as a symbol of a future leader who will arise from this empire, a figure who will challenge God's authority and oppress his people. In Christian interpretation, this little horn is often associated with the figure of the Antichrist, a powerful and blasphemous ruler who will appear in the end times. However, the vision also reveals that this ruler's power will not last forever. In the end, God's kingdom will triumph, and the Son of Man, an important figure in Christian theology, will receive everlasting dominion and authority. The vision in chapter 7 sets the stage for the following visions in Daniel, all of which point to the eventual triumph of God's eternal kingdom. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision, this time involving a ram and a goat. The ram with 2 horns is understood to represent the Medo-Persian Empire, while the goat with 1 large horn symbolizes the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. The vision also mentions the breaking of the goat's horn, which signifies the death of Alexander and the subsequent division of his empire. The little horn in this vision, which grows out of one of the goat's 4 horns, is often interpreted as symbolizing a ruler who will arise from the Greek Empire, commonly associated with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid king who persecuted the Jews in the 2nd century BC. This vision, like the one in chapter 7, emphasizes the cyclical nature of earthly kingdoms and their eventual destruction at the hands of God's kingdom. As the visions continue, Daniel receives more detailed revelations about the future. In chapter 9, Daniel is given the prophecy of the 70 weeks. This prophecy outlines a period of 70 weeks of years, or 490 years, during which significant events will unfold. The prophecy begins with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, likely referring to the decree given by King Artaxerxes to Nehemiah to rebuild the city. The 70 weeks are divided into 3 periods: 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 final week. The first period of 7 weeks refers to the time it would take to rebuild Jerusalem, while the 62 weeks represent the period leading up to the arrival of the Messiah. The final week, which remains unfulfilled in the immediate historical context of Daniel's time, is generally understood to refer to the events leading up to the end times, including the rise of the Antichrist and the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. One of the most important aspects of Daniel's prophetic visions is the recurring theme of the coming Messiah, who will bring an end to the oppressive powers of the world and establish God's reign on earth. In chapter 9, Daniel speaks of a prince who will come and bring an end to sin and establish everlasting righteousness. Christian interpreters traditionally identify this figure as Jesus Christ, whose first coming was marked by his death on the cross, and whose second coming will bring about the final victory over evil. The prophecy also mentions the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the sanctuary, which many see as a reference to the Roman destruction of the city in 70 AD and the subsequent scattering of the Jewish people. Chapter 10 marks the beginning of the final set of visions Daniel receives, and it is in this chapter that the most detailed account of the spiritual warfare taking place behind the scenes is revealed. In this vision, Daniel is visited by a divine being who explains that the delay in answering Daniel's prayers was due to a battle in the spiritual realm where angelic forces were contending with the prince of the Persian kingdom. This vision highlights the reality of spiritual warfare and the forces of darkness that influence the course of history. It also emphasizes the importance of persistence in prayer and faithfulness in seeking God's will, even when the answer seems delayed. In chapters 11 and 12, Daniel receives a more detailed and sweeping prophecy that covers the history of the Jewish people from the time of Daniel until the end of days. This prophecy is often seen as a detailed account of the conflicts and struggles that Israel would face under various empires, including the rise of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms, the Maccabean revolt, and the Roman occupation. The vision also points to the ultimate climax of history, when the forces of evil will be defeated and the faithful will be rewarded with eternal life. The final chapter speaks of a time of great tribulation, which is often associated with the period of suffering before the second coming of Christ. Yet, the vision also offers a message of hope, for those who are faithful to God will be vindicated in the end. Throughout all of Daniel's visions, there is a central theme that runs through each revelation: the sovereignty of God over history. The visions reveal that, while earthly empires may rise and fall, it is God's kingdom that will ultimately endure forever. The kingdoms of men may seem powerful in their time, but they are transient and will be destroyed by God's eternal rule. The coming of the Messiah, the Son of Man, and the establishment of God's kingdom are the ultimate hope and assurance for believers, both in Daniel's time and in our own. The visions in Daniel, though filled with complex symbolism and imagery, are not meant to confuse or frighten, but rather to encourage believers to remain faithful, knowing that God's plan is unfolding and that His kingdom will triumph over all earthly powers. In conclusion, the prophetic visions of Daniel provide a panoramic view of human history from a divine perspective. They show the rise and fall of great empires, the oppression of God's people, and the ultimate victory of God's kingdom. Through these visions, Daniel's faithfulness to God is rewarded, and the hope of God's people is renewed. While these prophecies have been interpreted in various ways throughout history, their central message remains the same. God is in control of history, and His kingdom will prevail in the end. The figure of the Antichrist is one of the most discussed and controversial topics in biblical prophecy, and the book of Daniel is one of the key texts where references to this figure appear. While the term Antichrist itself is not explicitly used in Daniel, the characteristics and actions of the Antichrist are foretold through symbolic visions and prophecies that point to the rise of a future tyrannical ruler who will oppose God's people and the true worship of God. Understanding the figure of the Antichrist in the book of Daniel requires careful attention to the symbolic language used and the context of the visions Daniel received, which describe a series of empires, rulers, and events that point toward the ultimate enemy of God and His people. In the 7th chapter of Daniel, the prophet receives a vision of 4 beasts emerging from the sea, each representing a different kingdom. The 4th beast is described as more terrifying than the others, with 10 horns, and among these horns a small horn emerges, speaking boastful and blasphemous words. This little horn is widely understood by scholars and theologians as a symbol of a future ruler, often identified as the Antichrist. The little horn is notable for its arrogance, its defiance of God, and its persecution of the saints. It is described as making war against the saints and prevailing over them for a time. However, the vision also makes it clear that this ruler's reign will not last forever. As the Ancient of Days, God will ultimately judge the kingdom of this ruler and establish an eternal kingdom that will never be destroyed. The 10 horns of the 4th beast are often understood to represent 10 kings or kingdoms that will arise in the end times, leading to the rise of this Antichrist figure. The small horn that emerges from these 10 horns is depicted as a king who will be different from the others. His power will be greater, and he will speak against God, even attempting to change times and laws. The actions of this small horn point to a figure who will not only challenge earthly powers, but will directly oppose God's authority, leading to great tribulation for the people of God. The description of this ruler matches many of the characteristics that are later associated with the Antichrist in other parts of the Bible, especially in the New Testament, such as in the letters of Paul and in the book of Revelation. In Daniel 8, the vision of the ram and the goat provides another glimpse into the future ruler. The ram, with 2 horns, represents the Medo-Persian Empire, while the goat, with a prominent horn, represents the Greek Empire. The large horn of the goat is broken, and 4 smaller horns arise in its place, representing the division of the Greek Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. Out of one of these smaller horns arises another little horn that grows in power and becomes exceedingly great. This little horn is often associated with the figure of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a historical ruler who persecuted the Jewish people, desecrated the temple, and attempted to force Hellenistic worship upon the Jewish people. However, many scholars believe that this historical figure serves as a type or precursor of the Antichrist, a shadow of the future ruler, who will come in the end times with similar attributes of blasphemy, persecution, and defiance of God. The little horn of Daniel 8 is described as exalting itself against the prince of the host, interpreted as God, and taking away the daily sacrifices from the temple. This action symbolizes the Antichrist's attempt to abolish true worship and establish himself as the object of worship. In Daniel 9, the prophecy of the 70 weeks adds another layer to the understanding of the Antichrist. In this prophecy, the period of 70 weeks is divided into 3 segments: 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 final week. The final week is particularly important because it is during this time that the prince who is to come will make a covenant with many. But in the middle of the week, he will break the covenant, causing the abomination of desolation to stand in the holy place. This prophecy is often linked to the actions of the Antichrist in the last days. The prince who is to come is understood to be a ruler who will deceive many by offering peace and security, but in the middle of the final week, he will break his promise and desecrate the temple, leading to great tribulation. The abomination of desolation refers to a sacrilegious act that desecrates the place of worship, and in the case of the Antichrist, this will involve his attempt to take the place of God and demand worship from all people. The actions of the Antichrist, as described in Daniel, are marked by a pattern of deceit, destruction, and defiance of God's authority. This ruler will not only persecute the saints, but will also seek to establish a global system of control where he will be worshipped as a god. His rise to power will be marked by a period of apparent peace and prosperity, during which he will make alliances and promises, but his true nature will be revealed when he breaks his covenant and reveals his blasphemous intentions. The Antichrist will seek to unite the world under his rule, but this will ultimately lead to the judgment of God. One of the key aspects of the Antichrist's reign, according to Daniel, is the period of intense persecution that will be directed toward the people of God. The saints will be oppressed, and it will seem as though the forces of evil are prevailing. However, the vision also assures the faithful that this period of tribulation will be temporary. The Ancient of Days will judge the little horn, and the kingdom of the Antichrist will be destroyed. God's eternal kingdom will be established, and the saints will receive their reward. This message of hope is a central theme in the book of Daniel, reminding believers that no matter how powerful the forces of evil may seem, they will ultimately be defeated by God's sovereignty. The book of Daniel also provides insight into the nature of the Antichrist's rule. His power will be based on deception, manipulation, and the use of force. He will have a supernatural ability to deceive the masses, and his rise to power will be marked by miraculous signs and wonders that will deceive many into believing that he is a divine figure. His goal will be to establish a world religion in which he is worshipped as God. He will demand absolute loyalty and will persecute those who refuse to worship him. The book of Daniel makes it clear that the Antichrist will be a master of propaganda, using both charm and coercion to gain followers and establish his global rule. However, the book of Daniel also emphasizes that the Antichrist's reign will not last forever. His time is limited, and God will ultimately bring about his defeat. The vision in Daniel 7 assures the faithful that, despite the apparent power of the Antichrist, God's kingdom will triumph in the end. The defeat of the Antichrist will be followed by the establishment of God's eternal kingdom, where righteousness and peace will reign forever. Throughout the book of Daniel, the figure of the Antichrist serves as a warning to the people of God. It is a reminder that there will be times of great tribulation, but these times will not last forever. The Antichrist will not prevail, and God's justice will ultimately prevail. The faithful are called to remain steadfast, to trust in God's sovereignty, and to look forward to the ultimate victory of his kingdom. In the end, the Antichrist's defeat will pave the way for the coming of God's eternal kingdom, where his people will dwell in peace and righteousness forever. In conclusion, the book of Daniel provides a rich and complex picture of the rise and fall of the Antichrist. Through symbolic visions and prophecies, Daniel reveals the actions, character, and ultimate defeat of this figure, who will oppose God and his people in the last days. While the Antichrist will bring great suffering and tribulation, the message of Daniel is clear. God is sovereign, and his kingdom will ultimately triumph. The faithful are called to remain faithful to God, knowing that his victory is certain, and that the Antichrist's reign will be short-lived. The book of Daniel, then, offers both a warning and a promise. Warning of the dangers of false worship and the rise of the Antichrist, but also a promise of ultimate victory and eternal peace in the kingdom of God. The book of Daniel is often considered a cornerstone in understanding biblical prophecies about the end times, including the figure of the Antichrist. While Daniel's visions and prophecies stand out for their vivid imagery and symbolism, they also align closely with other significant biblical prophecies, particularly those found in the books of Revelation, 2 Thessalonians, and even the Gospel of Matthew. To fully grasp the role of the Antichrist in the biblical narrative, it is essential to explore how the book of Daniel's depiction of this figure relates to and complements other scriptural references to the Antichrist, weaving together a clearer picture of his identity, actions, and ultimate downfall. One of the most direct connections between Daniel and other biblical prophecies about the Antichrist can be found in the parallelism between the little horn in Daniel's visions and the figures described in the New Testament. In Daniel chapter 7, the prophet describes 4 great beasts, representing 4 kingdoms, with the 4th beast being particularly terrifying. This beast is identified as the Roman Empire, which, according to many scholars, still plays a crucial role in eschatological events. From this beast, 10 horns emerge, symbolizing 10 kings or kingdoms that will arise in the last days. Then, a little horn rises among the 10, speaking boastfully and waging war against the saints. This little horn is widely interpreted as a representation of the Antichrist. The description of this little horn in Daniel chapter 7 closely parallels the figure of the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The Apostle Paul describes this figure as one who will exalt himself above all that is called God or is worshipped, sitting in the temple of God and proclaiming himself to be God. This direct correlation between the little horn in Daniel and the man of lawlessness in Thessalonians helps bridge the Old and New Testament understandings of the Antichrist. Both figures are characterized by their arrogance, their desire to usurp the place of God, and their persecution of the saints. Furthermore, the book of Revelation provides additional insight into the Antichrist's role in the end times, with the beast in Revelation 13 often being equated with the Antichrist. In this vision, John sees a beast rising from the sea, much like Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts. This beast has 10 horns and 7 heads, which are symbolic of the same 10 kingdoms and the powers that will align themselves with the Antichrist in the last days. The beast is given authority to rule for 42 months, a period often understood as a reference to the time of the Antichrist's reign. This period is the same as the time frame mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, where the little horn is given power to persecute the saints for a specific duration. The connection between the beast in Revelation and the little horn in Daniel highlights a continuity in biblical prophecy. The Antichrist will arise from a coalition of 10 kingdoms, and his reign will be marked by intense persecution and blasphemy. In both Daniel and Revelation, the Antichrist's rise to power is preceded by a time of great chaos and upheaval. In Daniel, the prophet sees the 4 beasts emerging from the turbulent sea, symbolizing the instability and conflict that characterize the nations in the last days. Similarly, Revelation speaks of a time of tribulation, with wars, famines, and natural disasters preceding the Antichrist's appearance. This connection between the chaos leading to the rise of the Antichrist emphasizes the troubled times in which this figure will appear, a period of intense trial and suffering for the world and the people of God. The Antichrist will emerge as a false savior, offering solutions to the chaos, but ultimately leading the world into further darkness. Another significant connection between Daniel and other prophecies concerning the Antichrist can be found in the concept of the abomination of desolation. In Daniel chapter 9, the prophet speaks of a prince who will come and make a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will break the covenant and cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. This is often understood as a reference to the actions of the Antichrist, who will desecrate the temple and bring an end to the worship of God. This abomination of desolation is also mentioned by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, where he warns that when the abomination of desolation is seen standing in the holy place, the faithful should flee to the mountains. Jesus' reference to this event places it in the context of the Great Tribulation, a time of unparalleled suffering which is directly associated with the appearance of the Antichrist. The abomination of desolation represents the ultimate act of blasphemy and defiance against God. It signifies the moment when the Antichrist will reveal his true nature, demanding worship and allegiance from all people, and ultimately setting up a false religion that seeks to replace true worship of God. This act of desecration is often linked to the Antichrist's installation of an image of himself in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, an event that is seen as the climax of his attempt to usurp God's throne. The commonality between Daniel's prophecy and Jesus' warning in Matthew reinforces the understanding that the Antichrist's reign will be marked by sacrilege and blasphemy. In addition to the book of Revelation and the epistles of Paul, The prophetic references to the Antichrist in the Old Testament also draw from the events in Daniel. For instance, in the book of Ezekiel, we see a figure referred to as the Prince of Tyre, who embodies pride, arrogance, and self-deification. Though Ezekiel's prophecy is primarily focused on the historical king of Tyre, many scholars interpret this figure as a type of the Antichrist, particularly in his self-exaltation and rejection of God. This mirrors the actions of the little horn in Daniel, who seeks to elevate himself above God and lead people astray. Moreover, the symbolism of the 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7 and the 10 kings in Revelation suggests that the Antichrist will not rise to power in isolation, but through alliances with other rulers and nations. This is consistent with the portrayal of the Antichrist in other biblical prophecies, where he is often seen as a political and military leader who secures his position through alliances and treaties. The Antichrist's ability to unite a coalition of nations under his leadership mirrors the unity that the 10 kings represent, though his ultimate goal will be to control and dominate these nations for his own purposes. Despite these connections between Daniel and other prophetic texts, there are also significant differences in how the Antichrist is portrayed. In the book of Daniel, the emphasis is often on the political and military aspects of the Antichrist's rise. He is a leader who conquers and oppresses, using his power to crush opposition and establish his authority. In contrast, the book of Revelation focuses more on the religious aspects of the Antichrist's reign. The beast in Revelation is not only a political ruler, but also a religious leader, demanding worship and allegiance from the world. This dual aspect of the Antichrist, both political and religious, emerges as a central theme in the final days, as the Antichrist attempts to usurp God's authority in every sphere of human life. In conclusion, the book of Daniel provides a foundational understanding of the Antichrist and his role in the end times, and it is intimately connected with other biblical prophecies that further elaborate on his identity, actions, and ultimate defeat. From the little horn in Daniel to the man of lawlessness in Thessalonians and the beast in Revelation, these prophecies converge to paint a comprehensive picture of the Antichrist as a figure of great power, arrogance, and blasphemy. However, the consistency across these texts also emphasizes the ultimate defeat of the Antichrist and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. The relationship between Daniel and other prophecies about the Antichrist underscores the certainty of God's sovereignty, even in the face of the rise of evil in the last days. The book of Daniel has been the subject of intense study and interpretation for centuries. Its prophecies, particularly those related to the rise of the Antichrist and the end times, continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about biblical prophecy. The modern interpretation of these prophecies is influenced by historical events, advances in biblical scholarship, and an evolving understanding of world politics and religion. While some interpretations remain rooted in traditional readings, others have emerged in response to global changes, leading to a variety of views on what Daniel's visions truly mean for today's world. One of the most prominent areas of focus in modern interpretations of Daniel is the prophecy of the 4 beasts in chapter 7. Traditionally, these beasts have been interpreted as representing 4 successive empires: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. However, in modern times, scholars and theologians have also considered the possibility that these empires might represent broader historical epochs or future powers, including the idea that the last beast may refer to a future world government or alliance. This view aligns with the belief that the end times will be marked by a global political system that mirrors the power and reach of ancient empires, but with more advanced technology and control mechanisms. Such interpretations often link the 4th beast to the concept of a new world order, a term that has gained prominence in conspiracy theories and discussions about global governance. Another key prophecy in Daniel, the vision of the little horn in chapter 7, is often associated with the Antichrist. The little horn's rise from the 10 horns of the fourth beast has been interpreted as the emergence of a powerful leader who will oppose God and persecute the faithful. Modern interpretations often view this figure through the lens of political and religious leaders who have risen to power in recent centuries, particularly in relation to totalitarian regimes and dictatorial rule. The figure of the Antichrist, according to these interpretations, could manifest as a charismatic world leader who gains control over a global government, manipulating international relations and using advanced technology to establish his authority. In this view, the little horn represents not only an individual, but also the broader spiritual and political forces that will converge in the last days to oppose God's kingdom. In addition to political interpretations, modern readings of Daniel's prophecies often emphasize the spiritual and moral dimensions of the end times. The vision of the abomination of desolation in Daniel 9, for example, has been understood as a warning about the dangers of idolatry, false worship, and the corruption of religious institutions. Some scholars argue that the abomination desolating the temple was historically fulfilled in the desecration of the Jewish temple by Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century BCE. However, many modern interpreters believe that this prophecy also has a future fulfillment, pointing to the eventual rise of a global religious system led by the Antichrist that will seek to replace true worship with false teachings. This interpretation highlights the increasing trend of religious syncretism and the rise of secular ideologies that challenge traditional faiths, with the Antichrist seen as the embodiment of this global spiritual deception. Modern interpretations of Daniel also draw attention to the connection between the prophecies of Daniel and the events described in the New Testament, particularly the book of Revelation. The imagery of beasts, horns, and the final judgment in Daniel finds its counterpart in the visions of the Apostle John. The beast of Revelation, with its 10 horns and blasphemous claims, mirrors the fourth beast in Daniel's vision, suggesting that the Antichrist, as represented by the little horn, will have a global and destructive influence during the end times. The rise of the Antichrist is often seen as part of a broader narrative of spiritual warfare, where the forces of good and evil engage in a final struggle for dominance. In this context, Daniel's prophecies are often read as a blueprint for understanding the cosmic battle that will unfold in the last days, with the Antichrist as the central antagonist. The modern interpretation of Daniel's prophecies also reflects the growing sense of urgency and expectation surrounding the end times. Many contemporary Christians, particularly those who subscribe to premillennial dispensationalism, view the events described in Daniel as being imminently applicable to the present day. They see the rise of globalism, the acceleration of technological advancements, and the increasing influence of authoritarian regimes as signs that the end of the age is drawing near. The appearance of the Antichrist is often seen as the next major event on the prophetic timeline, with the expectation that he will soon reveal himself and begin his campaign of global domination. This sense of anticipation has led to an increased focus on political events, particularly in relation to the Middle East, as key indicators of the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies. One of the most significant factors influencing modern interpretations of Daniel's prophecies is the role of Israel in biblical prophecy. The restoration of Israel as a nation in 1948 has been seen by many as a fulfillment of prophetic scripture, including the prophecies found in Daniel. The book of Daniel mentions the return of the Jewish people to their land and the rebuilding of the temple, events that some interpret as precursors to the arrival of the Antichrist. In this view, the re-establishment of Israel is seen as a sign that the prophetic clock is ticking and the Antichrist's appearance is imminent. Additionally, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, particularly surrounding Jerusalem, is often viewed as a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies about the final struggle between the forces of good and evil. Modern interpretations of the Antichrist in Daniel also highlight the importance of understanding the Antichrist as both a political and religious figure. In the past, the Antichrist was often portrayed as a purely political figure, a dictator who would rise to power and dominate the world. However, contemporary readings emphasize that the Antichrist will also be a false messiah, a religious leader who will deceive people with miraculous signs and wonders, leading them to worship him as God. This dual nature of the Antichrist, as both a political leader and a religious figure, is seen as crucial for understanding his power and influence. The rise of false religions, the spread of secular humanism, and the growing acceptance of the idea of a universal spirituality are all viewed as signs that the world is preparing for the arrival of such a figure. In conclusion, the modern interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel is marked by a blend of historical analysis, political observation, and theological reflection. While many of the traditional interpretations of Daniel's visions continue to hold sway, new readings have emerged that emphasize the contemporary relevance of these ancient prophecies. The figure of the Antichrist, as depicted in Daniel, is increasingly seen as a symbol of the global, political, and religious forces that will align in the last days to oppose God's kingdom. As modern events continue to unfold, the prophecies of Daniel are increasingly viewed as a roadmap for understanding the end times and the role of the Antichrist in shaping the course of history. The end of the Antichrist and the triumph of Christ are pivotal events in biblical prophecy, especially in the books of Daniel and Revelation. These events not only mark the conclusion of the Antichrist's reign, but also signal the culmination of human history as we know it, with the ultimate victory of good over evil. The figure of the Antichrist, who for a time has been the source of chaos and persecution for believers, will finally be defeated by the second coming of Christ, who will establish his eternal kingdom and bring about the final judgment. In the book of Daniel, the end of the Antichrist is clearly signaled in the visions of chapters 7 and 8. The little horn that emerges in the vision of the fourth beast is often interpreted as a representation of the Antichrist, a world leader who will rise in the last days to unleash fierce persecution upon the saints. However, the vision also shows that, at the end of this period of tribulation, the Antichrist will be defeated. Daniel describes how the beast will be destroyed by the direct intervention of God. In the vision of the fourth beast, it is stated that the kingdom of the beast will be consumed and destroyed to the end. Daniel 7:26. This event marks the beginning of the end for the Antichrist's empire and the start of the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. In the book of Revelation, Christ's triumph over the Antichrist is presented even more dramatically. The Antichrist, along with the false prophet, will be thrown into the lake of fire, where they will be punished for their evil and deceit. Revelation 20 describes this scene. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, and both were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. Revelation 20:10. This act not only symbolizes the final defeat of the Antichrist, but also the eternal condemnation of all those who followed him and allied themselves with him in rebellion against God. This is the culmination of divine justice, which is executed after a period of great suffering and apostasy. The defeat of the Antichrist is an essential part of the restoration of divine order on earth and the establishment of Christ's kingdom. Christ's return, a central theme in both Daniel and Revelation, will mark the beginning of a new world order. Christ's kingdom will be one of peace, justice, and holiness. Unlike the Antichrist's kingdom, which is characterized by oppression, lies, and corruption, Christ's kingdom will be a perfect government in which God's justice will prevail over all mankind. Revelation 20 describes how, after the defeat of the Antichrist, Christ will reign on earth for 1,000 years, a period known as the millennial reign. During this time, Satan will be bound and will no longer be able to exert his influence over the nations, allowing for an era of unprecedented peace. Throughout history, many have speculated about the exact nature of this millennial reign. For some, the millennium is a literal period of 1,000 years during which Christ will reign physically on earth, while for others, it is a symbol of Christ's spiritual victory and his reign in the hearts of believers. However, what is clear in both interpretations is that Christ's triumph over the Antichrist will be definitive and irreversible. At that moment, Christ's victory will be complete, and injustice, evil, and rebellion will be eradicated forever. Once the millennial reign concludes, Revelation 20 describes the final judgment, when all the dead will be resurrected and stand before God's throne. This judgment will be the climactic event in which the righteous will be separated from the wicked. Those who followed the Antichrist, those who rejected God and lived in sin, will be condemned to the lake of fire, which is the second death. In contrast, the righteous, those who remained faithful to Christ, will inherit God's kingdom and live forever in his presence. Daniel's final vision of the end of the Antichrist complements this with the prophecy of the resurrection of the dead. In chapter 12, Daniel receives a revelation about the end of time and the resurrection of the dead. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:2. This resurrection is the event that precedes the final judgment, and it is a clear manifestation of God's justice, who will reward the righteous with eternal life and punish the wicked with eternal condemnation. The end of the Antichrist is not only the end of a tyrannical and oppressive regime, but also the end of suffering for believers. During the era of the Antichrist, followers of Christ will experience persecution and pain. However, this suffering will serve a divine purpose: to purify believers and prepare them to receive their ultimate reward. In the end, those who have remained faithful to Christ will be freed from all oppression and will live forever with him in his eternal kingdom. This is the comfort and hope of Christians throughout history, that despite the hardships and trials, the final victory of Christ is assured. Furthermore, Christ's victory over the Antichrist symbolizes the fulfillment of all the promises God made to his people throughout the Scriptures. The establishment of Christ's kingdom represents the restoration of everything that was lost with the fall of Adam and Eve. Suffering, sin, and death will be eliminated forever, and God will be recognized as the absolute sovereign over all creation. On that day, believers will experience the fullness of salvation, peace, and the glory of God, and will live in a renewed world where God's presence will be the light that illuminates all things. The defeat of the Antichrist and the triumph of Christ also have implications for the Christian life today. Believers are called to live in the hope of this glorious future, knowing that although evil may seem to prevail in this moment, Christ's final victory is guaranteed. This hope should motivate Christians to live with faithfulness, to resist the temptations of the world, and to place their trust in God's power to bring justice. The end of the Antichrist and the victory of Christ are the horizon of history, and believers are called to be witnesses to this truth in their daily lives. In conclusion, the end of the Antichrist and the triumph of Christ represent the closing of human history as we know it, and the beginning of a new era in which God will be glorified throughout his creation. The final defeat of the Antichrist, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment are events of immense significance that not only mark the end of evil, but also the full realization of God's kingdom. This triumph is the hope and promise that Christians eagerly await, knowing that ultimately, divine justice will prevail and good will triumph over evil forever. The study of the book of Daniel and its prophecies offers us a profound insight into the ultimate triumph of good over evil, especially in the context of the Antichrist and the return of Christ. Through the visions, Daniel reveals a future that is both terrifying and hopeful. A future where evil, personified by the Antichrist, will have its time, but will eventually be vanquished by the divine authority and power of God. While the rise of the Antichrist and the period of tribulation are marked by suffering, they are not the final word in the narrative of history. The victory of Christ is the conclusion to this cosmic struggle, offering hope to all who endure in faith. The prophecies in the book of Daniel, when read in light of the larger biblical narrative, emphasize that despite the challenges believers face in the present, God's kingdom will ultimately triumph. The Antichrist may deceive many, wield power, and create havoc, but his reign is not eternal. The destruction of the Antichrist and his false kingdom is inevitable, as foreseen in both the visions of Daniel and the revelation of John. These moments of victory are pivotal in understanding the larger arc of God's redemptive plan for creation. The defeat of the Antichrist will not only mark the end of his rule, but will also usher in the fullness of God's kingdom, a kingdom that is characterized by peace, justice, and eternal life for those who are faithful to God. In our current world, where evil seems to rise in many forms and the challenges of life can feel overwhelming, the message of Daniel serves as a reminder of God's ultimate sovereignty. While the enemy may appear to have the upper hand for a time, believers are called to persevere, to remain faithful, and to hold fast to the hope that Christ's return will bring an end to all suffering and oppression. The book of Daniel provides not only a prophetic glimpse into the future, but also practical encouragement for Christians today. It reminds us that no matter how dark the times may seem, God's light will shine through, and His justice will prevail. The triumphant return of Christ is not just a future event, but a present reality for those who follow Him. As we live in the light of this hope, we are called to stand firm in our faith, to resist the temptation to compromise with the world, and to anticipate the glorious day when Christ will make all things new. The final defeat of the Antichrist and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom will bring an end to evil and suffering, offering believers the fulfillment of every promise made by God throughout the Scriptures. For Christians, this is not merely a distant hope, but a hope that shapes how we live today, living in expectation of Christ's return and working to reflect His kingdom in our lives. In conclusion, the book of Daniel paints a powerful picture of the spiritual battle between good and evil and the ultimate victory of Christ. The rise of the Antichrist, though daunting, is temporary, and it will be overshadowed by the eternal reign of Christ. This is the essence of the Christian hope, the assurance that no matter the trials we face, God is in control, and in the end, His victory will be complete. The call to believers is clear. Live in the light of this victory, trust in God's plan, and remain faithful, knowing that the end of the story has already been written and the triumph of Christ is assured.